History begins with the written word. In our world, this innovation dates to the late 4th millennium BC, roughly 6,000 years ago, when the inhabitants of Uruk, a Sumerian city in Mesopotamia, began scratching pictographic symbols onto clay seals. So before this, there is no history, at least not in the sense that we mean it today, because there was no writing. But that is not to say that there was no culture. In fact, far from it. The first use of tools dates all the way back to between 2 and 3 million years ago. Jewelry has been found dated to 150,000 years ago. Anyone who has seen the incredibly detailed and beautifully evocative paintings at Chauvet Cave in France, dating to about 40,000 years ago, will immediately understand that just because people don't write down their history does not mean that they don't have a rich cultural community. So while our history begins at its earliest in the 4th millennium BC, our prehistory is an equally fascinating story, a tale of humanity's origins and of our true nature. And because our sources of information are so different, it's up to the archaeologists and anthropologists among us to tell it. Dark Souls, by comparison, blurs the lines between prehistory and history deliberately. The mythic cosmogony of Dark Souls begins with the narration of the opening cutscene, and for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume the narrator is reliable. Meanwhile, history in Dark Souls begins with the written word, the compilation of item descriptions and other documentary sources through which we can know many of the more recent specifics of the world. But between "and with fire came disparity" and the written word of Lordran is a massive gap, much like in our own world, heavily obscured by the depths of time and the lack of written evidence, but no less significant or compelling. To take just one minor example, from what we're shown in the opening cutscene, after Gwyn and the others find the Lord Souls, he and his Silver Knights attack the ancient dragons with Gwyn's bolts of lightning. But what the hell happened in between those two scenes? First we are shown naked, primitive beings crawling from the dark towards the light of the first flame, and then we are shown an army preparing for battle. An army, complete with intricate, standardized plate armor, requires a high level of civilizational organization, to say the least. In fact, the cynical among us might even say that such war-making innovations are the hallmarks of civilizational structure. In order to have an army like this, there must be a complex, specialized society behind it. For most of human existence, there was no such thing as a soldier, much less a knight. Most fighting was done by whoever was available, using weapons which were likewise a matter of availability. Gwyn and his knights have skipped several millennia of real-world civilizational progress in the span of a single scene. Not to mention, by the time of this cutscene, Gwyn is already a king, or at least a lord, again implying substantial hierarchy and organization that is not directly attested to nor explained. And this is not specific to Gwyn and his knights. The gold-hemmed black set tells us that Quelana, quote, wore this gold-hemmed black set before even the Age of Fire, end quote, indicating that Izalith too had societal structure, a hierarchy codified in dress, etc., even before the Age of Fire. There is much that will never be known about these periods. These are events which are only implied, but never directly spoken of. Like in our own world, between the age of mythology and the age of proper written history lies the yawning chasm of prehistory. But just like in our own world, just because we can't read about it doesn't mean we can't study it. Only we must rely on the archaeology to point us in the right direction. And nowhere is this more true than in the ancient human settlement of Ulasil, a city built atop a site where prehistoric man once dwelt. Today, Ulasil is a ruined abyssal wasteland. Before that, it was a bustling human city with a flourishing culture of golden light magic. We know the inhabitants of the city we meet in the DLC are human because the bloathead mask tells us their, quote, humanity went wild, end quote. But even before the events of the DLC, long before the ornate tiled structures and Romanesque arches of Ulasil arose, there were humans living on this land. According to Chester, quote, Ulasil has brought the abyss upon itself. Fooled by that toothy serpent, they upturned the grave of Primeval Man and incited its ornery wrath, end quote. The use of the word primeval there is quite interesting, as it seems to imply a human settlement before modern Ulasil. And sure enough, when we find Manus's grave, it does indeed bear all the hallmarks of a prehistorical people, specifically a megalithic burial site. The physical grave itself indicates, based on its shape, that Manus's original form was humanoid, or more specifically, in the shape of the humanity sprites we see throughout the Chasm of the Abyss. Of course, by comparison to his current, boss fight form, we can tell that his humanity running wild has warped his physical form. This is consistent with the description of his soul, which tells us, quote, Ancient Manus was clearly once human, end quote, physically twisting his form in much the same manner as happened to the human inhabitants of Ulasil. The grave is raised slightly, and the form is molded into the stone, which is actually quite atypical for Stone Age and Bronze Age burials, as we will see, but perhaps this was chosen by the developers to clearly convey the human form of ancient Manus. Otherwise, had he been buried in a dugout pit, like most Stone Age burials we know of, it would be much harder to convey this message. Speaking of his physical form, the form into which he has mutated is informative as well, with his recurrent horn-like protrusions. This, and the fact that he's a sorcerer, based on his staff, the sorceries he wields during his boss fight, and his item descriptions, makes this picture evocative of Stone Age, specifically Middle Stone Age or Mesolithic, shamans. He even uses an old wooden catalyst, quite fitting a pre-metalworking society. Of the discovered Stone Age shamans, the most famous is at Bad Dürrenberg, which was discovered in modern-day Germany and dates to roughly 9,000 years ago. Based on the animal bones found at this and related sites, archaeologists think that shamans, which is to say religious animists, in the ancient human time period used to wear the bones and skins of animals to perform their rituals, often specifically wearing antler headdresses to give themselves horns. These are ideas FromSoft would later iterate upon with the antler horns of cleric beasts in Bloodborne, even going so far as to have Brador scalp his slain cleric beast compatriot and don his antlers thereafter. Of course, given that this is prehistory, we can't know precisely what these rituals were, but it appears likely that they would commune with the spirit world, including ancestor spirits. The word shaman or shamanism derives from the word for to know, and is one of the commonest and earliest forms of religious practice. The shaman is the hallmark of the naturalistic religions that long predated our current religious landscape. Likewise, the artifact, perhaps grave good, over which Manus obsesses is the broken pendant, which reads, quote, half of a broken stone pendant. The vine appears to originate from Ulasil. A powerful magic can be sensed from this ancient stone, end quote. This too appears consistent with the materials used in Meso and Neolithic periods, largely stones, shells, bones, etc. All of this points to a Stone Age shamanistic tradition, with the salient features being the artifact made of stone, not metal, as opposed to Artorius' pendant, which is explicitly from Anor Londo, and the chain of the pendant being made from a vine, again indicating a naturalistic religion. So Manus, in his time, was likely a Stone Age shaman, a kind of proto-sorcerer, if you will, in the days of ancient man. But the most evocative aspects of this site are the surrounding stone pillars, most of which are broken during the boss fight, but one can still see the remnants after the fact, and they indicate unambiguously that this is a megalithic burial site, specifically of the stone circle type. Megalithic stone circles are one of the most famous kinds of Neolithic, although some date to the early Bronze Age, cultural sites. Of course, everybody knows about Stonehenge, especially if you're a long-term viewer of the channel, but Stonehenge is a bit peculiar, as it is not just a concentric stone circle, but also a henge-type site, which refers not to the standing stones, but to the surrounding ditch and embankment. Stonehenge is almost the exception that proves the rule. It has many peculiarities which are not necessarily generalizable to the rest of the stone circles. And boy are there a lot of them. Over 1,000 stone circles have been found just in Britain and northwestern France, and all dating to within a few century-long window, indicating this culture and practice was spread throughout the region by a common people. And though their exact purpose is not entirely known, they seem to have been partially used as gravesites, or mausolea, based on the presence of skeletons and cremated remains along with grave goods. And given how early they appear in the archaeological record, many in the 3rd millennium BC, and how much effort it would take to construct them with Stone Age or early Bronze Age technology, they reflect an unseen religious organization that may forever remain mysterious to us. Beyond stating the obvious that this reflects a kind of ancestor worship, we can't say much about the precise usage of these stone circles. But there's something almost universal about this practice, because while the British versions may be the most famous, they are certainly not restricted to Europe. The hunter-gatherer Jomon people of prehistoric Japan, in particular, made many standing stone monuments with at least superficial similarity to those in other parts of the world. Here they were probably not burial sites, as there is no evidence of systematic burial, unlike their European cousins. Instead, some have been found to function as sundials, but mostly they are thought to have been ceremonial sites, which in archaeology speak just means we really don't know. So it makes sense in a way that Miyazaki and his team would fuse the prehistoric traditions of his own land, specifically the Jomon, with the perhaps more recognizable prehistoric monuments of Britain, especially as the game is set in a European setting. Returning back to Manus' grave, we can see that this all fits quite nicely. He is buried in the middle of Neolithic concentric stone circles, clearly conveying his primeval origins. Before we continue, let's just appreciate Miyazaki and co. for using IRL archaeology to convey this message. I know we make this point a lot, but it is just so exceptional that it really needs to be pointed out. Without ever needing someone to directly tell us that Manus dates back to the dawn of man, so to speak, to a pre-literate society of shamans and animism, the story is right there all the same. Now, to be fair, no megalithic stone circles, at least as far as we're aware, have been found inside of a cave like this one, but caves are sites of immense importance to the development of religious practices in human prehistory. Shamanistic ritual implements, burial sites, and stunning wall art have all been found in caves across several continents. There is even evidence from Shanidar cave in modern Iraq, though its interpretation is of course hotly contested, that even Neanderthals buried their dead in caves. So ancient humanity and caves go a long way back, to say the least. If you wanted to depict the grave of Primeval Man, putting a megalithic stone circle inside of a cave is a pretty ingenious way to do that. But that was all long, long ago. Manus and his people have long since passed on, and overtop their burial sites was built a Golden Age city. In much the same manner as the Romans and later Anglo-Saxons, and then later still the Normans, provided successive waves of cultural influence onto the British Isles, modifying but not eliminating the pre-Roman, pre-literate Britannic culture, vestiges of Ulaseel's ancient naturalistic religion remains here and there, in the way that their sorceries are drawn not from moon magic or crystals, but from golden light, in the way that their gardeners are literally turning into plants, and their sorcerers use birch tree branches as catalysts. We can see the remnants of Uluseel's prehistoric past shining through. The Uluseel we explore is dominated by Romanesque architecture, again quite a fitting choice by the developers. The beautiful arches and rotundas concealing, at their depths, the very origins of mankind, in much the same way that actual Romanesque architecture would come to dominate Britain. Beautifully ornate cathedrals and plazas built right over top the graves of Primeval Man. But of course, that is not where the story ends, because the inhabitants of Uluseel would one day stumble across their own past, deep in the chasm of the abyss. Let us now turn to the Uluseel Sanctuary, or if the original Japanese is to be trusted, to the Uluseel Mausoleum. Sanctuary in English derives from the words meaning house or container for the sacred, and the Japanese word, rebyo, connotes that it is specifically a sanctuary where the dead, or their spirits, are housed and worshipped. So already, just from the name, we know this is a sacred place, one that likely houses spirits. We entered the sanctuary through a narrow tunnel of vegetation, making the reveal of the sanctuary at large all the more stunning. Surrounding and defining the structure is an arched colonnade, the roof of which has long since collapsed. But of course, the most remarkable and evocative features of this place are the statues of humanoid forms throughout the sanctuary. One might simply guess that these statues represent the spirits being worshipped, and while partially true, the full story is far more intricate and fascinating than that. The statues themselves are monoliths, carved from a single stone. They have scratches circumferentially around the torso which look vaguely like a writing script, and these scratchings are also found on the facade as well as on some of the uncovered stone in front of the statues. It's very hard to tell whether this is intended to convey a script or whether this is just a reused texture. Though if it is indeed writing, it would indicate that they are built by a later society than the one to which Manus belonged. Either way, we reach the same conclusion by the classical architecture of the colonnade and the adjacent arena. These are structures of a later, more advanced society. The form of the statues themselves, however, is where things start to get really interesting. They are, unmistakably, in the form of the humanity sprites seen throughout the Chasm of the Abyss. From this, we can immediately draw one critical conclusion. The people that built this sanctuary had already seen and were familiar with the Chasm of the Abyss. Not only that, but this was such a significant moment for them that they built a sanctuary to house effigies of the humanity sprites. Here, the real-world archaeology is only partially useful. The closest IRL cognate to something like this, giant humanity statues, would be the Moai from Easter Island, or perhaps related tiki and similar statues from Southeast Asian cultures. In both cases, the statues represent ancient humans. In the case of the Moai, they are thought to represent ancestor worship. To bring this back to Uluseel, this would make a certain amount of sense. After all, the humanity sprites, by way of being fragments of the Dark Soul, are, in a sense, the ancestors of all mankind in this world. So it may be that the Uluseelians were practicing a form of ancestor worship here. But that is only a partially satisfying explanation. For one, the statues depict the larger and lesser forms of the humanity sprites, precisely what is seen in the Chasm of the Abyss, but not exactly what you'd expect for ancestor worship. And furthermore, like the Moai of Easter Island, which all face the ocean from the nearby bluffs, these statues are oriented in a very particular manner. In fact, they are all arranged in a manner as to suggest that they are gazing inwards towards the central hearth, where today the bonfire sits. This is not just any ancestor worship. It seems this sanctuary depicts a very specific scene. It depicts a scene of first contact. We know Ulasil by now is no stranger to the Chasm of the Abyss and its secrets. Of course, they eventually perturbed the grave of Manus and set his humanity loose. But what about before that? Based on the fact that there are not one, but two elevators leading directly from Ulasil down to the chasm, it's safe to say they visited the place fairly often. And based on the scene in the Ulasil sanctuary, we know they revered these humanity sprites. A significant amount of time must have passed between the building of this sanctuary and the eventual catastrophe that would befall the city. And once again, Miyazaki and his team have made that quite clear based on the architecture. The sanctuary is classical and is already so old that it is collapsing, only the archways and the facade remaining, whereas Ulasil proper is Romanesque, a later style, and aside from the spreading corruption of the abyss, is in pretty good shape, at least structurally speaking. So to return to the humanity statues, what this all seems to convey is that at the time they were built, prior to the current peak age of Ulasil, they reflected knowledge of the Chasm of the Abyss and the humanity contained therein. And the peculiarities of this scene can be understood only with the knowledge that this sanctuary commemorates a very specific moment in time, the discovery of the chasm, and the first contact with the humanity sprites. That is why both larger and smaller humanity sprites are shown, just as they are today in the chasm. That is why the colonnade was built around the sanctuary, to enclose it in much the same manner as a cave. In fact, in real-world British prehistory, the most famous types of grave sites, the long barrows and even more so the dolmen, are thought to have been built for exactly this purpose, as artificial caves in which to conduct shamanistic rituals and burials. This is how humanity adapted its religious practices for a brave new world. So, one can imagine how this would have looked at its peak. The initiate being walked through the narrow tunnel entrance, then entering the massive enclosed sanctuary, like a grand artificial cave, the flickering light of the central bonfire scattering dancing shadows across the faceless forms of the humanity sprites. What a powerful scene this must have been, even in its reconstruction. And finally, commemoration of this scene of first contact explains the peculiar orientation of the statues in the sanctuary. This must have been how they were actually found during that very first encounter. It's possible the central point of orientation was Manus's grave itself, that they were all found congregating around his grave. But that's not exactly what we see in-game, and while possible, we favor another interpretation. Today, in the central hearth, the humanity statues face a bonfire, and we know that humanity is drawn to the flame. So imagine the first explorers of this cave, stumbling across the chasm, their torchlight faintly illuminating the walls, and being slowly surrounded by the humanity sprites, curious, alien, and powerful, drawn like moths to the flame. This is the Prometheus moment, when humanity discovered its attraction to fire. This in Dark Souls and in the real world is the most important story we don't know. The moment the first humans were drawn to fire, poked at it, carried it, eventually mastered it, is when everything changed for our species. The first technological advance that began everything. The most important moment of unknowable prehistory. It is no coincidence that no other mammal is drawn to fire, including our own cousins, non-human primates. Quite the opposite, in fact. Modern humans, the survivors of countless layers of genocidal competition with other hominids, still present a common, innate attraction to it. It is no stretch to imagine that the first weird mutant of a primate that felt an urge toward fire, rather than to run away from it, would eventually learn to harness its power. And with it, a terrifying and deadly advantage over all those who would not. And so began true humanity, selected for its ability to harness fire and everything it afforded. Warmth, light, protection, cooking, metal. In the paleoanthropological record, the first evidence of a hearth appears 800,000 years ago in the eastern Mediterranean. In Dark Souls, that Prometheus moment happens in Ulasil, where we still see commemoration of humanity's first gathering around a hearth. Like Elizabeth says, quote, "May the flames guide thee," end quote. And here, in the Ulasil Sanctuary, we have a representation of humanity's dual nature. We are drawn to the flame, but we are born of the dark.